Larry Wu-Tai Chin was, for more than 3 decades, one of the most damaging spies ever to work inside American intelligence. And he did it not by stealing anything exactly, but simply by doing his job, which was to read. He was a translator. That was all on paper. A quiet, courteous, middle-aged Chinese-American man who sat at a desk inside the United States intelligence apparatus and turned Chinese into English and English into Chinese. Day after day, year after year, for the people who needed to understand what China was saying and thinking. He was good at it. Better than good. Trusted. Valued. Decorated. He held one of the most sensitive positions a linguist can hold. He read the classified traffic, the intercepted broadcasts, the internal reports, the raw material out of which the United States built its understanding of communist China. Everything of importance about China that flowed through his part of the American system passed at some point before Larry Chin's eyes, because reading it and rendering it was precisely what he was paid to do. And here's the thing that makes his story so quietly staggering. Everything that passed before his eyes, he also passed to the other side. For over 30 years, through the Korean War, through the long freeze between Washington and Beijing, through the secret opening of relations, through administrations and crises, and decades, Larry Chin was a paid agent of Chinese intelligence, sitting inside the United States government, reading America's most closely held assessments of China and quietly delivering them in his head and on film to the very country they were about. He was not a break-in artist or a safecracker. He was a man given legitimate, authorized access to secrets as a condition of his employment, who betrayed that access so smoothly and for so long that no one suspected him for the better part of a working lifetime. He retired with a commendation. He was caught only because someone on the other side gave him up. That is the paradox at the center of him, and it is worth holding on to. The most dangerous kind of spy is not the one who sneaks in. It is the one who is invited in, handed the keys, and thanked for his service. The trusted insider, whose treachery is indistinguishable from the outside, from loyalty. Larry Chin spent his career being helpful, reliable, and unremarkable, the last man anyone would examine, and that ordinariness was his perfect and permanent cover. He was hiding in the one place no one thought to look, in plain sight, at his desk, doing exactly what he had been hired to do. To understand how a man reads a superpower's secrets aloud to its rival for 30 years and is never caught, you have to go back to China in the 1940s, to a young interpreter, a collapsing country, and a recruitment that happened so early that by the time he ever set foot in the American system, he was already theirs. Larry Wu-Tai Chin, Jin Wudai in the Chinese of his birth, was born in the early 1920s in China, into the turbulence of a country coming apart. He grew up in a China that barely held together. Warlords, foreign concessions, the long agony of the war with Japan, and, beneath all of it, the deepening civil war between the nationalists and the communists that would decide the country's fate. He was educated, clever, and, crucially, he learned English well enough to work as an interpreter, which in that place and time was a valuable and marketable skill. Language, for a young man in that shattered country, was a kind of passport. It could carry you into rooms otherwise closed, put you at the elbow of powerful foreigners, make you useful to people who could not function without you. It was also, though no one thinks of it this way at 19 or 20, a form of quiet power. The interpreter stands between two parties who cannot understand each other, and everything they say to one another passes through his mouth. He is trusted absolutely by both, because both depend on him utterly, and neither can check what he does with what passes through him. There is no more natural home for a spy than the space between two languages, and Larry Chin found that space early and never left it. A young Chinese man, fluent in both languages, could find work with the Americans who were present in China in growing numbers through the war years and after, and who needed people who could bridge the enormous gap between the two languages and the two worlds. Larry Chin became one of those bridges. He took work as an interpreter and translator for the Americans, with the U.S. Army, and then with the American Diplomatic and Information Services operating in China. It is worth stopping to picture that world, because it made him and it explains him. China in the 1940s was a country being torn apart from every direction at once. First, the brutal occupation and war with Japan, which killed millions and gutted the nation. And then, as that ended, the resumption of the civil war between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists, a struggle for the soul and future of a fifth of humanity. For an educated young Chinese man in those years, there was no neutral ground and no stable footing. The government you served today might be gone tomorrow. The Americans were everywhere: soldiers, diplomats, advisors, aid missions. The great foreign power propping up the nationalists and trying to shape China's fate, and they needed local men who spoke both languages to function at all. A bilingual young Chinese was a person of real value in that world, courted by the Americans for his usefulness and watched quietly by the communists for the same reason. To sit at the seam between the Americans and China, as Larry Chin did, was to sit exactly where the communist underground most wanted its people to be. And it was there, while he was still a young man working for the Americans in a China sliding toward communist victory, that the other side reached him. This is the detail that makes his whole career so remarkable, and so much worse than an ordinary betrayal. Larry Chin was recruited by Chinese communist intelligence extraordinarily early. In the late 1940s, during the Civil War, before the People's Republic even existed, while he was working inside the American establishment in China. He was not a loyal American official who turned years later. He was turned at the very beginning, so that from nearly the first day of his long association with American intelligence, he was already an agent of the other side. Everything that followed, the decades of trusted service, the access, the career, was, from the Chinese point of view, a single continuous operation. A man planted early and left to grow roots inside the enemy's house. Why did he do it? The question hangs over the whole story, and the honest answer is that it was probably a tangle of things, as these things usually are. There was ideology and identity. He was a Chinese man in a moment when a new China was being born in blood and fire, and the pull of one's own people and one's own country's rise is powerful. There was, from early on, money. The Chinese paid him and would pay him well over the years, and he liked money and what it could buy. And there may have been, layered over both, the story he told himself, that he was not really a traitor at all, but a kind of bridge, a man uniquely placed to help two great and hostile nations understand each other, working in his own secret way toward a reconciliation he genuinely wanted. Spies who last a long time usually need a story like that, something nobler than greed to tell themselves in the mirror. And Larry Chin, as we will see, clung to his version of it all the way to the end. It helps, too, to remember what identity meant for a man like him, because it is easy for outsiders to treat loyalty as a simple thing when for Chin it was anything but. He was a Chinese man who spent his life inside the American establishment, an insider and an outsider at once, belonging fully to neither world. To the Americans he worked among, he was always, on some level, the foreign linguist, valued for his difference. To China he was the son who had gone to serve the other side. A man suspended like that between two civilizations and wholly claimed by neither is fertile ground for exactly the kind of recruitment that caught Chin, and for exactly the kind of self-justification that sustained him. If you belong to both and neither, it becomes possible to tell yourself that serving one by betraying the other is not treason at all, but a higher loyalty to both, a bridging of the very divide your own life embodies. That is not an excuse, but it is an explanation of how a man carries such a contradiction for 30 years without breaking, and it is the soil in which the bridge builder's story grew. There is another dimension to the recruitment worth understanding, because it explains why it held for so long where so many agents burn out or defect. The Chinese did not run Larry Chin the way the Soviets often ran their agents, with heavy pressure, tight control, and the constant implied threat. Chinese intelligence in that era was known for a patient, long-horizon style for planting people young and letting them grow slowly into position over decades, for treating an agent less like a hired hand to be squeezed than like a seed to be cultivated. That suited a man like Chin perfectly. He was not a nervous, coerced operative living in terror of his handlers. He was a long-term investment, given time, given room, allowed to build an ordinary and successful American life, precisely because that life was the cover and the value. A spy who is comfortable, respected, and unhurried is a spy who lasts. And Larry Chin was made comfortable, and he lasted longer than almost anyone in the history of the trade. Whatever the exact mixture the recruitment took, and it lasted. When the communists won and the nationalists fled to Taiwan and the Americans pulled back from a China now closed and hostile, Larry Chin did not go with the losing side. He carried his American employment and his hidden Chinese loyalty forward together into a new phase in which the young interpreter of the Civil War would become something far more valuable. An insider in the American intelligence machine at the exact moment America most needed to understand the China he secretly served. There is a cold brilliance in the timing of it. Whether or not anyone planned it that way, as the bamboo curtain came down and China sealed itself off, the United States found itself half-blind toward a vast, hostile, secretive power it now urgently needed to read. And the harder a country is to see into, the more it must rely on the few windows it has. Translators of Chinese, men who could turn the closed country's words into American understanding, became precious exactly because China had become opaque. So the very event that should have made Larry Chin useless to Beijing, the closing of China, the freeze between the two nations, instead made him more valuable than ever, because it made his seat at the window more important than ever. Beijing had placed its man not at some peripheral post, but at one of the narrow apertures through which America squinted at China across a generation of hostility. As long as the two countries remained strangers and needed men like Chin to interpret each other, Chin's betrayal would keep paying dividends. He was planted, in effect, at the keyhole. The Americans, not knowing what they had, gave Larry Chin a job that could not have been better designed to do them harm. After the communist victory, Chin continued working for the United States, and in time, he came to the position that would define his life. He became a translator and analyst for the arm of American intelligence, responsible for monitoring and translating foreign, and especially Chinese, communications and broadcasts. In plain terms, his job was to sit at the intake of America's understanding of China and process it. Intercepted material, official Chinese broadcasts, internal documents, the raw flow of information out of the closed communist state. Much of it came through translators like Chin, and Chin was among the best and most trusted. He read Chinese language intelligence and rendered it into English for the American officials who would base their policies on it. And in the other direction, he had access to classified American material, assessments, reports, documents that revealed what the United States knew, thought, and intended about China. Sit with what that access meant, because it is the whole engine of the damage. To do his job, Larry Chin had to be trusted with secrets. He had to be allowed to read classified documents. That was not a security lapse. It was the nature of the work. A translator who is not cleared to read the sensitive material cannot translate the sensitive material. So the system, entirely properly by its own logic, gave this man legitimate, authorized daily access to some of the most closely guarded American thinking about China. And this man was and had been, from the start, a Chinese agent. Every safeguard the system had was built to keep unauthorized people out. Larry Chin was authorized. He was inside the wall by invitation, and no wall protects you from the man you have invited in. Understand what his corner of the intelligence world actually did, because it explains the value of the seat he held. A great deal of what a country learns about a closed rival comes not from dramatic cloak-and-dagger theft, but from the patient monitoring of what that rival says. Its official broadcasts, its published statements, its internal communications, the vast river of words a state produces. Sifting and translating that river is a discipline of its own, and it is enormously revealing. A skilled analyst can read the shifts in a rival's propaganda and language the way a doctor reads a patient's chart, catching the signs of what is really happening behind the closed doors. Chin sat inside that discipline at the point where the Chinese language flood was turned into English understanding for American policymakers. He saw both the raw material and, crucially, the American product, the assessments, the conclusions, the classified analysis of what it all meant. That gave him something almost uniquely valuable to Beijing. Not just raw facts, but a view of the American interpretation, the finished picture of China that the United States was building. He could tell his masters not only what the Americans knew, but what they thought they knew and how close or far that was from the truth. That is a spy's most precious gift of all, and Larry Chin was positioned to give it every working day for 30 years. Think, too, about the peculiar invisibility of the translator, because it is central to how he survived. In any large intelligence organization, there is a hierarchy of glamour and suspicion. The case officers, the analysts who write the assessments, the executives who brief the president, these are the people watched, vetted, cultivated, and when things go wrong, investigated. The translator is furniture. He is the essential, overlooked functionary through whom everything must pass, but on whom no attention rests. The man who converts the raw foreign words into something the important people can read and then fades back into the background. No one imagines that the linguist is the threat, because the linguist has no rank, no policy role, no obvious reason to betray. And yet the translator, precisely because everything passes through him, may see more of the genuinely sensitive material than many of the senior people who outrank him. Larry Chin occupied that blind spot for a lifetime. He was too humble a figure to suspect and too central a figure to be kept from the secrets. The ideal position, if what you actually are is a foreign agent, and the last position anyone thinks to guard. And so, for decade upon decade, Larry Chin did two jobs at once, seamlessly. For the Americans, he translated China's words into English, faithfully and well. For the Chinese, he translated America's secrets into a form he could carry out, memorized, summarized, and at times photographed, and delivered to his handlers. He was the perfect double instrument, the same eyes, the same desk, the same skills, serving both masters, the loyal employee and the buried agent, occupying a single quiet man in a single quiet office. There is no line in his working day where honest labor ended and treason began. They were the same act, the same reading of the same page, forked only at the end into two destinations, one to his American superiors and one to Beijing. This is what makes his case so hard to file alongside ordinary spies. He did not have to sneak into rooms he wasn't allowed in, or copy files he wasn't cleared for, or do anything at all that a diligent employee wouldn't do. His crime was invisible because it was woven into work that was not itself criminal. To catch him, you would have had to see not what he did, which was unremarkable, but what became of what he knew, and that happened far away. In Hong Kong tea houses, and through couriers he never named, out of sight of anyone who could connect it to the mild man at the translation desk. He came to work. He read America's secrets about China, and he made sure China learned them. It was espionage reduced to its purest and most economical form. He barely had to do anything that wasn't already his job. He only had to remember and to talk to the right people on the other side. The mechanics of getting it out were careful and patient, the way successful long-term espionage always is. Chin did not hand documents across a table in Washington. He worked through the classic tradecraft of couriers and foreign meetings. He would photograph or memorize classified material, and the information would make its way to Chinese intelligence through intermediaries and rendezvous in places outside the United States, Hong Kong above all, the great open door between the Chinese and Western worlds, and other foreign cities where a Chinese-American man traveling could meet contacts without drawing the attention such meetings would draw at home. He was disciplined. He was unhurried. He did not flaunt, did not take wild risks, did not draw eyes. Over the years, he built a rhythm of quiet betrayal so steady and so unremarkable that it simply blended into the background of a long, respectable career, and the very consistency of it was its protection. Nothing about Larry Chin ever spiked. He was always the same reliable translator, and reliable translators do not get investigated. Hong Kong was the hinge of the whole operation, and it is worth understanding why. In the decades when the People's Republic was sealed off from the West, Hong Kong, still under British rule, was the one great meeting place where the two worlds touched, a crowded, cosmopolitan port through which people, money, and information flowed between communist China and everywhere else. A Chinese-American man traveling to Hong Kong drew no suspicion at all. It was one of the most natural destinations in the world for someone of his background, whether for family, for business, or simply for the pleasures of the city. And in Hong Kong, amid its crowds and its constant traffic between the mainland and the outside, a meeting with a Chinese contact could take place in perfect ordinariness. A relative visited, a business associate seen, A face in a tea house among 1,000 faces. This is the genius of good tradecraft. It does not invent suspicious behavior, it hides inside behavior that is already completely normal. Larry Chin's trips abroad never looked like a spy's movements. They looked like the entirely explicable travels of a Chinese-American man with ties to the Chinese world, which is exactly what they also were. He was careful, too, about the money, at least in the ways that mattered to his cover. Whatever he was paid over the years, he did not suddenly appear one day in a mansion he could not explain. The wealth accumulated gradually over decades, folded into the ordinary story of a thrifty, hard-working man who had invested shrewdly in property and had, everyone assumed, simply done well for himself. It was only when you added it all up, the properties, the gambling, the cash, against a translator's government salary that the arithmetic stopped working. But no one added it up because no one had any reason to, and a sum that no one calculates raises no alarm. And so, for decade upon decade, the quiet rhythm continued. What did all of this actually cost the United States? The answer is that we may never fully know, and that the parts we do know are grave. The single most striking piece of the damage, the one most often cited, has to do with the great secret turning point in the relationship between the two countries, the opening of relations between Washington and Beijing at the beginning of the 1970s. When the American government under President Nixon moved in deep secrecy toward its historic reconciliation with Communist China, the diplomatic revolution that would reshape the Cold War, that intention was among the most closely held secrets in the world. And Larry Chin, from his seat inside American intelligence, is understood to have given Beijing advanced knowledge of American thinking and intentions in that period, so that the Chinese leadership went into the most important negotiations of the era already knowing, in effect, some of what the other side was holding. Imagine sitting down to a high-stakes game against an opponent whose cards you have already seen. That is the advantage a well-placed spy hands his masters, and in the delicate diplomacy that opened China to the world, Larry Chin helped hand it to Beijing. And there is a strange, vertiginous quality to Chin's role in that particular episode, because the opening of relations was, on its face, the very thing he claimed to want, the reconciliation of the two countries he loved. Here his two identities blur into each other in a way that is genuinely hard to untangle. As an American intelligence employee, he processed the secret movement toward China. As a Chinese agent, he told Beijing about it, and in his own telling, both of those acts served the same good end, bringing the estranged giants together. A cynic sees only a spy handing his masters an intelligence edge in a negotiation. A more troubled observer sees a man who may have genuinely believed he was greasing the wheels of peace, and who was, at the same time and by the same act, betraying the trust of the country that had cleared him to see its deepest secrets. The opening of China is where the bridge builder's story is at once most plausible and most damning, because it is the one place where what he wanted and what he betrayed were the very same thing. There is an earlier and darker chapter that many accounts of the case emphasize, reaching back to the Korean War at the very start of Chin's long service. In those years, the United States and Communist China were at open war on the Korean Peninsula, and thousands of American soldiers fell into Chinese and North Korean captivity. It has been alleged, and was part of the shadow that hung over his case, that the intelligence Chin was passing in that period included material of use to his masters in their handling of American prisoners and their understanding of American intentions in the war. That a man reading America's secrets about China during a shooting war between the two countries was, in the plainest sense, aiding the enemy his own soldiers were dying to fight. Whatever the precise extent of it, the point is chilling and general. Larry Chin's betrayal did not begin as a Cold War abstraction of documents and assessments. It began in wartime, while Americans and Chinese were killing each other, with an American translator quietly serving the side his uniform was fighting. But the opening of relations is only the most famous item on a much longer, mostly hidden bill. For 30 years, Chin fed the Chinese a steady picture of what American intelligence understood about China, which meant he was also telling China what America did not understand, where its blind spots were, which of its sources and assessments were good, and which were wrong. That is a devastating gift. A country that knows what its rival knows about it can manage the rival's perception, Reinforce the misconceptions, hide what is genuinely secret, feed the enemy's known channels with the picture it wants the enemy to have. Over 3 decades, Chin gave Beijing an enduring window into the American mind on China, and with it the power to shape and manipulate that mind. The harm of that is not a single dramatic leak. It is the slow, cumulative corruption of a superpower's understanding of its most important rival, sustained across a generation. This is the hardest kind of damage to measure and the most important to grasp, so it is worth making concrete. Intelligence is not simply a collection of facts. It is a picture built up over years of how a rival thinks, what it fears, what it plans, what it believes about you, where it is strong and where it is weak. Nations act on that picture. They decide where to place their forces, how to negotiate, when to press, and when to hold back, all on the basis of what their intelligence tells them the other side is doing and intending. A spy like Chin does not just steal individual secrets. He tells the other side what picture you're forming of them, and that lets them correct it in the direction they prefer, feeding your known channels with reassurance where they are actually strong and alarm where they are actually weak, quietly steering your entire understanding of them off true. Over 30 years, you can move a superpower's map of its rival a long way from reality without ever staging a single dramatic theft. That is the deepest thing Larry Chin did, and its cost cannot be counted in documents. It has to be counted in decisions, in every choice America made about China across 3 decades that was shaped, to some unknowable degree, by a picture the Chinese had been allowed to help paint. And because the damage is so diffuse, it can never be fully undone, even once the spy is caught. When a safecracker is arrested, you change the locks and the loss stops. When a Larry Chin is arrested after 30 years, you cannot untell Beijing what it learned, cannot reach back and unshape the decisions that flowed from a corrupted picture, cannot recover the advantage silently transferred across a generation. The catching of him ended the leak. It could not repair the years, and there is the human cost that lurks behind all espionage of this kind. Harder to trace, but impossible to dismiss. Intelligence that reveals what America knew about China could reveal how America knew it, could point, however indirectly, toward the sources and methods and people on whom that knowledge depended. In the shadow world, exposed knowledge can mean exposed lives. It is impossible to draw a clean line from Larry Chin's quiet reports to any specific person's fate, and one should be careful not to invent one. But it is the nature of what he did that its full consequences reached into places no accounting can fully follow, and that some of the price was very likely paid by people whose names never appeared in any newspaper. This is the quiet horror underneath all espionage of the highest sort, and it deserves to be said plainly, even where it cannot be proven. Intelligence about a rival is not abstract. It is built by human beings, taking risks, a source in a ministry, an officer running that source, a network of people who trust one another with their lives to get a truth out of a closed country. When a spy inside your own house reveals what you know, he risks revealing, however indirectly, how you came to know it. And every such revelation is a tug on the thread that could unravel a network and cost the people in it their freedom or their lives. Larry Chin worked at the level where American knowledge of China was assembled, and to hand that knowledge to Beijing was potentially to hand Beijing the means to hunt for its own leaks. No one can now trace which threads, if any, his reporting helped pull, but the possibility is not paranoia. It is the ordinary logic of the trade, and it is part of the true weight of what he did. For all of this, Chin was paid, and paid well over the years. And this is where the man's private life turns strange and revealing, because the money had to go somewhere, and where it went was not secret at all. Larry Chin lived, on the surface, a comfortable American life, and beneath the surface, a somewhat lavish one for a translator. He acquired real estate. Over the years, he came to own multiple properties, an investment portfolio built quietly on the proceeds of his other career. And he gambled. He was drawn to the casinos, to Las Vegas, to the tables, and he moved sums of money that a man on a translator's salary should not have had. Here, in hindsight, is one of those signs that is invisible until it is suddenly obvious. A mid-level government linguist with a taste for high-stakes gambling and a portfolio of properties spending beyond any apparent means. In the world of counterintelligence, unexplained wealth is one of the oldest red flags there is. But no one was looking at Larry Chin because Larry Chin gave no one any reason to look, and a red flag that no one sees might as well not be there. There is something almost poignant in the shape of that double life. By day, a modest, courteous public servant, the kind of employee who is praised in performance reviews and forgotten at parties. By some other measure, a man of property and appetite, moving real money across gaming tables, living a second life that his first life could never have paid for. The two did not obviously touch. To his colleagues, he was Larry, the dependable translator, unassuming and mild. The other Larry, the one with the portfolio and the taste for the casinos and the secret income from Beijing, lived alongside the first so quietly that the seam between them never showed. This is what long-term espionage actually looks like, stripped of the movies, not car chases and gunfights, but a man leading two entirely ordinary-seeming lives at once for decades and keeping the books of both in his head and never letting the wrong page show. The strain of that, sustained across a working lifetime, is its own kind of achievement and its own kind of prison. And there was a marriage inside it. Chin had a wife and a household, and the domestic ordinariness that completed the picture of the harmless retiree and by the account that emerged, a wife who came to know or to share in the secret, drawn into the hidden half of his life, as spouses of long-term agents so often are. The secret that no colleague ever guessed lived, in the end, inside his own home, held between two people, behind an unremarkable suburban door. It is one more layer of the concealment. The spy, who is not a lone figure in the shadows, but a married man with a house and a routine. The most invisible disguise of all. He might have gone to his grave undiscovered. That is the sobering truth of it. 30 years of quiet, disciplined betrayal had left no thread for American counterintelligence to pull, no operational mistake, no pattern that anyone had noticed. In 1981, after a long and honored career, Larry Chin retired from his position in American intelligence, and on his retirement he received a commendation, a medal of appreciation for his years of faithful service. Read that again and let it land. The United States government gave a formal token of gratitude to one of the most damaging spies in its history on his way out the door for a career spent betraying it. He had beaten the system so completely that the system honored him for it. There is no sharper image of what makes the trusted insider so dangerous than that medal. Every dollar a security service spends, every clearance procedure and background check and polygraph is built to sort the loyal from the disloyal, to keep the enemy out and reward the faithful. Larry Chin walked through all of it for a lifetime and came out the far end not merely undetected, but decorated. The system's own machinery of judgment, reaching its verdict on him and getting it exactly, completely backwards. He did not defeat the safeguards by breaking them. He defeated them by satisfying them, by being, to every test the system knew how to apply, a model of reliability. The commendation was not a fluke or an oversight. It was the logical conclusion of 30 years of flawless deception, the system faithfully rewarding the appearance Chin had spent his whole career perfecting. A spy who is caught has, in some sense, failed. See, a spy who is thanked has succeeded so completely that his own victims applaud him out the door. He settled into a comfortable retirement, a respected former public servant with his properties and his savings. The perfect double life apparently carried, intact and undetected, all the way to its peaceful end. Pause on how nearly he made it. Retirement is, for a long-term spy, the finish line, the point at which the access ends, the exposure shrinks, and the operation, if it has survived this long, can be quietly closed with the agent safe and the secret kept forever. Chin had reached that line. He was out, decorated, comfortable, done. Another few years, and the trail would very likely have gone cold, beyond any recovery. The witnesses aged, the records buried, the man himself an unremarkable old retiree whom no one would ever have cause to examine. 30 years of flawless deception had bought him, it seemed, the one thing every secret agent dreams of, and almost none achieve. A clean escape, a betrayal carried whole into a peaceful old age, the perfect crime completed and closed. He was, by any reasonable measure, home free. And it is precisely there, at the very finish, with the race apparently won, that the thing no discipline can guard against reached out of Beijing and pulled him back. And then, as so often in this world, the thing that no tradecraft can defend against happened. Someone on the other side changed sides. Larry Chin was not caught by American brilliance or by his own mistake. He was caught because a high-ranking officer of Chinese intelligence defected to the United States and brought with him, among much else, the knowledge that there was a long-embedded Chinese agent inside American intelligence, a translator, a man who had served for decades. There is a bitter symmetry in that, and it is worth naming. Larry Chin's entire life was a demonstration of how a well-placed insider can betray the country that trusts him. And what finally undid him was another well-placed insider betraying the country that trusted him. An official of Chinese intelligence, a man on the inside of Beijing's secrets, who turned and walked into American hands and gave up what he knew. The same vulnerability that Chin had exploited for 30 years, the ineradicable danger of the trusted man who changes sides, reached across and destroyed him in the end. No system, however careful, can fully protect against the person it has already decided to trust. And that is as true of the Chinese service that ran Larry Chin as it was of the American one that employed him. Beijing's own version of Larry Chin, its own insider gone over to the enemy, was the instrument of his ruin. He was undone by exactly the kind of man he himself had been. The information the defector carried did not name Larry Chin outright, at least not simply. It described a source, a long-serving Chinese agent inside American intelligence, a translator decades in place. But a description is a thread, and American counterintelligence now had a thread where before it had nothing at all. This is the oldest and most reliable way that deep-cover spies are undone, not by detection, but by betrayal from within their own side. All of Chin's discipline, all his caution, all his flawless ordinariness protected him against being found by his enemies. None of it could protect him against being given up by his friends. Once the defector's information pointed the way, American counterintelligence had, at last, a thread, and following it back through the years, they found the quiet retired translator with the unexplained wealth, and they built their case. And in November of 1985, the FBI arrested Larry Wu-Tai Chin. The investigation that closed the ring was the patient, unglamorous work such cases require. Armed with the defector's description, a long-serving Chinese source, a translator, the counterintelligence officers had to match a shadow to a man, sifting the population of people who fit against the details of what was known, until the pieces settled onto a single retired linguist, whose career, whose access, and whose inexplicable finances all lined up with the profile. Once he was in view, the ordinary indicators that had gone unnoticed for a lifetime suddenly formed a pattern. The wealth beyond his salary, the pattern of foreign travel, the access his old job had given him to exactly the kind of material that had reached the other side. The very ordinariness that had protected him became, under focused scrutiny, its own kind of evidence. What the FBI eventually put to him, and what he came in part to acknowledge, added up to a portrait no jury could mistake. A portrait that Larry Chin himself, confronted with it, did not fundamentally deny, choosing instead to argue, not that he hadn't done these things, but that his doing them had been, in his own mind, something other than treason. The man who had been invisible for 30 years was suddenly, blindingly visible. In early 1986, he was put on trial, and the evidence, his own eventual admissions among it, was overwhelming. He was convicted on a long list of counts: espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, and tax evasion, because the money from Beijing had, of course, never been declared. There is a mordant footnote in that last charge, the tax evasion, and it is worth pausing on, because it captures something about how such men are finally pinned. A spy's espionage is, by its nature, hidden, deniable, argued over. But money leaves tracks. The undeclared income from a foreign intelligence service is, among everything else, it is taxable income that was never reported. And so the same secret payments that had funded his properties and his gambling became, in the end, an ordinary financial crime that any prosecutor could prove on paper. The grand betrayal and the mundane bookkeeping offense sat side by side on the same indictment. It is often the way. The towering treachery is hard to nail down, and it is the small, provable, unglamorous thing, the lie on the tax form, the money that cannot be explained, that helps close the trap. He faced the prospect of the rest of his life in prison and more. The scale of what he had done, spread across 3 decades and reaching into the highest secrets of the state, marked him as one of the most serious spies the country had ever prosecuted. The bridge builder, the faithful translator, the honored retiree stood exposed as exactly what he had been from the beginning, an agent of a foreign power who had spent his working life reading his adopted country's secrets to its rival. At his trial and after, Larry Chin did something that his prosecutors found galling and that his story cannot be told without. He defended himself not as a traitor, but as a benefactor. He insisted, in essence, that he had been working for reconciliation, that by giving each side a truer sense of the other, he had helped to ease the terrible hostility between China and the United States, helped to bring them together, served the cause of peace between two peoples he cared about. He cast himself not as a spy who had betrayed America, but as a bridge who had joined it to China, a man whose secret work had, in his telling, actually made the world safer by making the two giants less blind to each other. It was the story he had presumably been telling himself for 30 years, and he told it now to the court and to the world with apparent conviction. There is a reason this defense enrages prosecutors and fascinates everyone else, and it is worth being honest about both reactions. The rage is easy to understand. A man takes a foreign power's money for 3 decades, betrays the country that trusts and clears, and finally decorates him, and then, caught, refuses even to call it what it is, dressing 30 years of paid treachery in the robes of a peacemaker. To those who saw the damage, that was not remorse, but a final insult, the same slippery self-justification that had presumably let him sleep at night for 30 years, offered now as though it were a defense. But the fascination is real too, because the bridge builder story is not obviously entirely false, and Chin was not obviously entirely lying. It is genuinely possible for a man to be a paid agent of a foreign power and also to believe in some real chamber of himself, that he is serving a larger good. The human capacity to hold both of those at once, to take the money and mean the idealism, is close to bottomless. What makes Larry Chin unsettling, rather than simply contemptible, is that we cannot be sure he was only rationalizing. He may have been. He may also have half-believed his way through a lifetime of betrayal on the strength of a story that was, to him, as real as the cash. The court, of course, was not asked to judge his soul, only his acts, and his acts were not in serious doubt. Whether he believed it and whether there was even a grain of truth buried in it is one of the genuine puzzles of the case. And it did not save him, but it may, in a sense, have decided how his story ended, because Larry Chin never went to a sentencing hearing and never served his time and never grew old in a cell explaining himself. In February of 1986, only days after his conviction and before he could be sentenced, Larry Wu-Tai Chin was found dead in his cell in a Virginia jail. He had, according to the official finding, taken his own life, asphyxiating himself with a plastic bag tied over his head. He was in his 60s. The man who had kept the deepest secret of his life for over 30 years took the last of it with him, leaving no final testimony beyond the bridge builder's defense he had already offered, and a great many questions he would now never answer. Consider what died with him. Larry Chin was, at the moment of his death, one of the most valuable living human beings on Earth to American counterintelligence. He held in his memory the full architecture of a 30-year penetration, every handler he had dealt with, every meeting place, every method, every piece of information he had passed and when, and folded into all of it, an intimate knowledge of how Chinese intelligence actually operated over decades, how it recruited, how it ran its long-term agents, what it valued, how it thought. A cooperative Larry Chin, debriefed patiently over years, could have taught the United States more about its rival's Secret Service than any document ever could. That treasure was locked inside a man in a jail cell, and then, days after his conviction, the man was dead and the treasure was gone, unopened. And that is precisely why his death has never sat easily with anyone who has looked closely at the case. And of course, the manner and timing of his death fed immediate suspicion, as such deaths always do. Here was a man who knew, better than almost anyone alive, the full extent of a 30-year Chinese penetration of American intelligence. Every meeting, every courier, every piece he had passed, and perhaps things about the Chinese operation that even his captors did not yet fully grasp. A living Larry Chin, talking to interrogators over months and years, was a treasure and a danger both. A treasure to American counterintelligence and a mortal danger to the intelligence service that had run him, whose secrets and methods and people he could expose. There was, from the moment of his conviction, a race of sorts for what was inside his head. American interrogators wanted to open him slowly, over months and years, extracting the full map of the 30-year operation and everything he had absorbed about Chinese intelligence along the way. Beijing, one imagines, wanted precisely the opposite, for that map never to be drawn, for the secrets to stay sealed inside the only man who held them all. A cooperating Chin was the greatest imaginable prize for Washington and the greatest imaginable danger for Beijing, and both of those facts pointed at the same fragile object, a 60-something prisoner in a county jail, alive and talkative, worth more to two governments than almost any living man on Earth. A dead Larry Chin talked to no one. Oh, it does not take a conspiracy theorist to notice that his death was extraordinarily convenient for Beijing, and to wonder, as many have, whether the quiet translator who had kept so many secrets was truly the author of his own silencing, or whether the silence was arranged. The official verdict was suicide. The truth, like so much else about Larry Chin, went with him into the ground. The case for suicide is not weak, and honesty requires stating it. Larry Chin was a man whose entire life had just collapsed. The double existence he had balanced for 30 years was over. The bridge builder's self-image had been branded in open court as treason. He faced spending whatever years remained to him behind bars, disgraced, his properties and his freedom forfeit, his careful life reduced to rubble. Men have ended themselves for far less. A proud private man who has lost everything and faces only humiliation ahead is exactly the kind of man who might choose to control the one thing still in his power. The ending, seen that way, his death, is not a mystery at all, but the grimly logical last act of a ruined life. But the shadow will not lift because both readings fit the same facts, and that is the permanent condition of everything about Larry Chin. Perhaps he silenced himself out of despair. Perhaps he was silenced because he knew too much. Perhaps, and this is the possibility that lingers, even his death was, like his life, two things at once: a man's private surrender and a service's quiet convenience meeting in the same small cell. We will never know, and the not knowing is the fitting final chapter for a man who spent his whole life being two things no one could tell apart. And so, we are left with the two ways of seeing Larry Wu-Tai Chin, and they will not resolve into one. In the first, he is a traitor, plain and cold, one of the most successful and damaging spies ever to operate against the United States. In this reading, the bridge builder's story is exactly what it looks like, a self-serving fiction. The comforting lie a paid agent told himself and later told a court to dress up 30 years of betrayal as idealism. He took money, creates a great deal of it, from a hostile foreign power, and in exchange he sold out the country that employed him, trusted him, cleared him, and finally decorated him. He read America's secrets and handed them to America's rival for a generation, corrupting his adopted nation's understanding of its most important adversary, and doing damage whose full extent can never be measured. Whatever he told himself about peace and reconciliation, the plain fact is that he lived a lie inside the house that fed him and grew rich on the tables of Las Vegas with the proceeds. In this telling, his composure, his ordinariness, his very reliability were not innocence, but the tools of an exceptionally disciplined deceiver. And the only thing tragic about his story is how long it took to end. In the second reading, the picture is stranger and sadder and more human. Here, Larry Chin is a man caught from his youth between two countries and two loyalties, recruited before he was fully formed, in the chaos of a civil war, by the side that represented his own people and his own homeland's rise. Here, the bridge builder's story is not simply a lie, but a real, if self-flattering belief. The genuine conviction of a man who spent his life at the seam between two civilizations and came to see himself as their reconciler rather than either one's traitor, who may even have taken some quiet part in the very opening of relations that ended the long hostility. In this telling, his tragedy is the tragedy of divided identity itself. A man who could never be wholly of either country, who served both and betrayed both, who told himself he was healing a wound he was in fact helping to keep open, and who died alone in a cell in a country that was and was not his, with his true motives locked forever inside him. The money is real in this reading too. So is the harm. But so is the possibility that Larry Chin was not merely a mercenary, but a man genuinely lost between two worlds and never fully honest, perhaps not even with himself, about which one he was really serving. The truth, as with the deepest of these stories, is almost certainly both at once. He was a traitor and he was a bridge. He took the money and he believed the story. He served China faithfully for 30 years, and he may well have wanted, in some real corner of himself, the peace he claimed. He was the ultimate insider, invited in and trusted and honored, and he betrayed every bit of that trust with a patience and a calm that took a lifetime to unravel. And then, when it finally unraveled, he closed the account himself, or someone closed it for him before he could say the one thing everyone most wanted to know: which of his two countries he had truly loved. He read a superpower's secrets aloud for 30 years and delivered them to its rival, and was thanked for his service and honored on his way out, and caught only by a stranger's defection and dead before he could be sentenced. There has rarely been a cleaner demonstration of the oldest lesson in this whole dangerous trade. If a story like this one stays with you, stay with us. The most dangerous spy of all is the one you have already decided to trust.